Edwin Hawthorne was not sleeping. His head rested against the tall back of his leather chair, tilted slightly to one side, as though gravity had finally won the battle against age. His silver hair, perfectly combed earlier that morning, now fell across his wrinkled forehead in a way that made him look vulnerable. Harmless. His chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm that had fooled dozens of people before. His hands lay motionless on the armrests, fingers curled slightly inward like fallen leaves. To anyone who stepped into that room, Edwin Hawthorne looked like exactly what he appeared to be, an 82-year-old man who had drifted off into the kind of deep afternoon sleep that old men earn after long lives. But Edwin was wide awake. Behind his closed eyelids, his pale blue eyes were active and alert. His mind was not drifting through memories or dreams. It was sharp, focused, waiting. This was not rest. This was theater. And Edwin Hawthorne had been performing this particular act for nearly 40 years. He sat in the center of his private study, a room built entirely from dark mahogany and lined with shelves that held leather-bound books he had never read. The carpet beneath his polished Oxford shoes was Persian, hand-woven, and worth more than most people earned in a year. Above him hung a crystal chandelier that had once belonged to a European duchess. The room smelled faintly of cigars and old paper, a scent that clung to wealth the way smoke clings to curtains. Edwin wore a three-piece suit, navy blue with thin silver pinstripes, custom-tailored on Savile Row 3 months earlier. His silk tie was knotted perfectly. His cufflinks gleamed in the dim light filtering through the tall windows. Even in stillness, he looked like a man who commanded empires. And he did. Edwin Hawthorne owned 17 companies across 4 continents. He had built hotels that scraped the clouds, shipping fleets that crossed oceans, and tech firms that shaped how the world communicated. His name appeared on Forbes lists and charity galas. Politicians called him for favors. Celebrities begged for invitations to his parties. But none of them trusted him, and he trusted none of them. That was the bitter truth Edwin had swallowed decades ago, and it had shaped every decision since. His ex-wife had taken half his fortune in a divorce that made headlines. His 2 sons visited him twice a year, and only when they needed money or favors. His daughter sent birthday cards written by assistants. His business partner smiled at board meetings and then tried to vote him out when they thought he was weak. Even his household staff, the people he paid generous salaries to, had stolen from him over the years. A gardener had pocketed rare coins from his desk. A chef had sold stories about him to tabloids. A driver had been caught trying to auction off one of Edwin's vintage watches. Every single person, given the opportunity and the belief they would not be caught, would take what was not theirs. Edwin believed this with a certainty some people reserved for religion. It was not cynicism. It was observation. It was science. And today, like so many days before, he intended to prove it again. Behind Edwin's chair, mounted along the wall in custom frames, were stacks of currency. Not paintings, not photographs, actual money. $100 bills arranged in neat bundles, encased in glass like museum artifacts. 10 frames in total, each containing $10,000. They glowed under soft spotlights, a gallery of wealth displayed without shame or subtlety. Visitors often stared at them in disbelief. Some laughed nervously. Others asked if the money was real. It always was. Edwin had designed the display himself. He wanted people to see it. He wanted them to feel the weight of temptation, to understand that vast sums of money existed within arm's reach, separated only by thin glass and the fragile concept of honesty. The frames were not alarmed. They were not locked with complex mechanisms. A strong pull, a sharp object, and the glass would break. The money could be taken. Edwin wanted that possibility to exist, because only then could he measure a person's character. He had tested employees, business rivals, distant relatives, and strangers who wandered too close. Some passed. Most failed. And each failure only confirmed what Edwin already knew. People were predictable. Greed was universal. Trust was a fool's currency. Today, someone new was coming. Edwin had received the security report that morning. A young woman, recently hired. She will be cleaning the study this afternoon, alone, unsupervised. Perfect conditions. Edwin kept his breathing slow and even. He listened to the sound of footsteps approaching down the marble hallway outside. Soft footsteps. Hesitant. The door handle turned. Edwin remained perfectly still, his silver hair catching the dim afternoon light, his expensive suit rising and falling with each false breath of sleep. The game had begun. Ruth Carter stepped through the heavy door of Edwin Hawthorne's study as though she were walking into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. Her shoulders were tense, pulled up toward her ears in a permanent cringe that had become her default posture over the past 6 months of working in the Hawthorne mansion. Her dark hair was pulled back so tightly into a bun that it gave her a headache, but she didn't dare let a single strand fall loose. Everything about Ruth had to be perfect, controlled, invisible. One mistake, and she would lose everything. She was 34 years old, but the mirror lately showed her someone older. The lines around her eyes had deepened. Her hands, rough from years of scrubbing and cleaning, trembled slightly even when she tried to hold them still. Ruth had not slept well in months. Every night, she lay awake calculating bills, counting the days until rent was due, wondering how long her ancient car would keep running. She lived in a constant state of low-grade panic, the kind that sits in your chest like a stone and never quite goes away. This job was her lifeline. Mrs. Adelaide, the head housekeeper, had made that clear from the first day. Mr. Hawthorne does not tolerate imperfection, she had said, her voice cold and precise. He does not tolerate noise. He does not tolerate excuses. You will clean what needs cleaning, you will stay out of his sight, and you will never, under any circumstances, disturb him. Do you understand? Ruth had understood. She had nodded so vigorously that her neck hurt afterward. She needed this job more than she had ever needed anything. The pay was decent, far better than the diner where she had worked before, where customers left dollar tips and the manager stole half her shifts. Here, she could almost make ends meet. Almost. If she was careful. If she never made a mistake. But today, she had been forced to break one of the unspoken rules. Today, she had brought her daughter to work. Ruth glanced behind her, and there stood Lila, small and silent in the doorway. The girl was only 7 years old, but she had learned to make herself invisible in ways that broke Ruth's heart. Lila wore a simple red dress, the only nice one she owned, though it was getting too small for her. The hem that had once reached her knees now stopped several inches above them. Her black shoes were scuffed, held together by glue Ruth had applied 3 times already. And on her hands, much too large for her small fingers, were a pair of bright yellow cleaning gloves. Ruth had given her those gloves this morning in a moment of desperation. The school had called yesterday afternoon, announcing an emergency closure due to burst pipes and water damage. No classes for 3 days, possibly longer. Ruth had spent the entire evening calling every person she knew, begging for someone to watch Lila. Her neighbor was out of town. Her cousin wasn't answering the phone. The community daycare had a waiting list and cost more per hour than Ruth earned. By midnight, Ruth had run out of options. She had considered calling in sick, but she had already used her 2 sick days this month when Lila had the flu. Mrs. Adelaide had warned her, in that icy tone, that excessive absences would not be tolerated. Ruth knew what that meant. It meant replacement. It meant eviction. It meant choosing between electricity and groceries. So this morning, Ruth had dressed Lila in her red dress, knelt down in front of her, and looked into those wide, trusting brown eyes. "Baby, you have to come and work with Mommy today," she had whispered. "But you have to be very, very quiet. Like a mouse. Like you're invisible. Can you do that for me?" Lila had nodded solemnly. She always nodded. She never complained. Ruth sometimes wondered if that was healthy, if a 7-year-old should be so obedient, so understanding of adult problems. But there was no time to wonder about such things. There was only survival. Now, standing in Edwin Hawthorne's study with her daughter behind her, Ruth felt her throat tighten with fear. The old man sat motionless in his leather chair, head tilted back, apparently asleep. Ruth had been warned about this too. Mr. Hawthorne often fell asleep in his study. When he did, she was to clean around him as quietly as possible. Never wake him. Never get too close. Ruth turned back to Lila and knelt down, bringing her face level with her daughter's. She gripped the girl's small shoulders, perhaps too tightly, and whispered urgently, "Listen to me very carefully, Lila. Do you see that corner over there by the bookshelf?" Lila's eyes followed her mother's pointing finger and nodded. "You're going to sit there on the floor. You're not going to move. You're not going to touch anything. Not the books, not the furniture, nothing. Do you understand?" Another nod. "And you cannot make a sound. Not a word. Not a cough. Not even a whisper. That man in the chair is Mr. Hawthorne. He is sleeping. If you wake him up, Mommy will lose her job. Do you know what that means?" Lila's eyes grew wider, but she nodded again. She knew. Children who grow up poor learn early what it means when someone loses their job. It means no food, no home, no safety. If he wakes up and sees you here, we will both be sent away. We won't have money for our apartment. We won't have anywhere to go. So you have to be completely silent, like you're not even here. Can you promise me?" "I promise, Mama," Lila whispered, her voice barely audible. Ruth felt tears threatening, but blinked them back. She squeezed her daughter's shoulders once more, then guided her to the corner near the bookshelf. Lila sat down carefully on the thick carpet, folded her gloved hands in her lap, and became as still as a photograph. Ruth stood up, her heart hammering, and picked up her cleaning supplies. Her hands shook as she sprayed polish onto a cloth. She glanced at Edwin Hawthorne, still motionless in his chair, then at her daughter, sitting perfectly still in the corner. Lila's face showed no fear, only calm obedience, only trust that her mother knew what was best. That trust, Ruth thought, was the heaviest thing she carried. Edwin Hawthorne had placed the envelope on the side table exactly 17 minutes before Ruth Carter entered the room. He had done it carefully, methodically, the way a scientist arranges variables in an experiment he has conducted dozens of times before. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive Italian stationery, thick and textured. It lay half open, tilted at a precise angle, so that the contents were unmistakably visible to anyone who walked past. Inside were 50 $100 bills, crisp and new, their green faces catching the soft light from the table lamp. $5,000. Not enough to matter to Edwin. Not even a rounding error in his monthly expenses. But to someone like Ruth Carter, someone who probably counted pennies at the grocery store, it was a fortune. It was rent for 6 months. It was a reliable car. It was breathing room. It was hope. Edwin had set this trap so many times he could do it in his sleep, though sleep was something he rarely indulged in anymore. The location varied. Sometimes a bathroom counter, sometimes a desk drawer left conveniently ajar, sometimes a jacket pocket and a coat left hanging. But the principle remained the same. Create opportunity. Remove witnesses. Wait. The human animal, Edwin had long ago concluded, was fundamentally no different from any other animal. Place food in front of a starving dog and tell it not to eat, and eventually the dog will eat. Humans were the same. They simply had better excuses. He had tested this theory on 43 people over the years. Housekeepers, gardeners, personal assistants, business associates who visited his home, even a nephew who had come for Thanksgiving. 43 people. 37 had failed. They had taken the money, or the jewelry, or whatever bait Edwin had left for them. Some had failed within minutes. Others had lasted an hour, circling back to the temptation until they finally gave in. But they had failed. The 6 who had passed Edwin's test had surprised him, but not enough to change his fundamental belief. 6 honest people out of 43 only proved that honesty was rare, not that it was natural. And even those 6, Edwin suspected, might simply have been afraid of cameras or consequences. True virtue, he believed, did not exist. Only calculated self-interest. Today would be number 44. Edwin kept his breathing slow and even. His performance had to be flawless. He had learned over the years that people could sense when they were being watched. Some primitive instinct, left over from when humans were prey animals, made them uneasy. So Edwin had perfected the art of appearing deeply asleep. His face relaxed completely. His jaw went slack. His hands lay limp on the armrests. Only his hearing remained sharp, cataloging every sound in the room. He heard Ruth moving nervously near the bookshelves, the soft swish of her cleaning cloth against wood. He heard her breathing, quick and shallow with anxiety. He heard the occasional creak of her shoes on the floorboards. And then he heard something else. Smaller footsteps. The child. Edwin had known about the daughter. His head of security had mentioned it in this morning's briefing. Ruth Carter requested permission to bring her child to work today due to school closure. Mrs. Adelaide granted approval under strict conditions. Edwin had been pleased by this development. It added another variable to his experiment. Would maternal desperation make Ruth more or less likely to steal? Would the presence of a child increase the temptation or the fear? Behind his closed eyelids, Edwin tracked Lila's movements by sound. She had been sitting in the corner, perfectly still, just as her mother had instructed. But now, after several minutes, she was moving. Edwin heard the soft padding of small feet on carpet. Slow, cautious steps. The child was wandering. Edwin's pulse quickened slightly, though his exterior remained unchanged. This was interesting. He had not anticipated that the child would be the variable that moved first. Perhaps Ruth would panic, grab the girl, grab the money, and run. Perhaps the child would knock something over, create a distraction, provide cover. Either way, the outcome would be the same. The footsteps came closer. Edwin could sense the child's presence now, perhaps 4 feet away from his chair. 3 feet. She was approaching the side table. The table with the envelope. With the money. Of course she was. Children were even less disciplined than adults. They saw something shiny, something interesting, and they moved toward it like moths to flame. The child would grab the money, or try to, and Ruth would have a choice. Stop her daughter and return what was taken, or pocket it and stay silent. Either way, Edwin would learn what he needed to know. Behind his closed eyelids, Edwin's mind ran through the scenarios he had witnessed before. The physical therapist who had stolen $300 from his bathroom. The chef who had pocketed a silver serving spoon. The lawyer's wife who had taken a diamond bracelet from his bedroom during a dinner party. All of them had hesitated first. All of them had looked around, listened carefully, convinced themselves they were alone and unobserved. And then all of them had reached out and taken what was not theirs. It was always the same pattern. Hesitation, rationalization, action. Edwin could predict it as reliably as he could predict the sunrise. The child's footsteps stopped. She was right next to the table now. Edwin could hear her breathing, soft and steady, not labored with guilt or excitement yet. That would come. First the curiosity, then the desire, then the justification. Even children understood need, especially children who wore dresses that were too small and shoes held together with glue. Edwin waited. His fingers remained motionless on the armrests. His chest rose and fell in the same steady rhythm. To anyone watching, he was a frail old man lost in dreams, completely unaware of what was happening inches away from him. But Edwin Hawthorne was aware of everything. He always was. And in a few moments, he would be proven right once again. Another person would fail his test. Another confirmation that humanity was exactly what he believed it to be. Predictable, selfish, and weak. The child moved again. Edwin heard the soft rustle of fabric. A hand reaching out, perhaps. Fingers approaching the envelope. Any second now, Edwin felt the child's presence like a shift in air pressure. She was standing directly beside his chair now, close enough that he could hear the faint rustle of her red dress, the soft exhale of her breathing. His muscles remained perfectly relaxed, his face a mask of peaceful sleep, but internally every nerve was alert. This was the moment when human nature revealed itself. The moment when the child would reach for the envelope, when her small fingers would close around the money, when Edwin's theory would be confirmed once again. But then something unexpected happened. The child didn't move toward the side table. She didn't reach for the envelope. Instead, she stood there, silent and still, and Edwin could sense her attention shifting, not toward the money, toward him. Edwin felt a prickle of unease, though he couldn't explain why. He had been in this position countless times. He knew how to read people through sound and instinct alone. But this child was not behaving according to the script. She should be drawn to the cash, mesmerized by the visible wealth. Children were even more impulsive than adults. They lacked the self-control, the social conditioning that made adults hesitate before stealing. A child should have grabbed the money immediately. But Lila stood motionless, and Edwin could feel her eyes on him. Not on his possessions. On him. Then he heard something that made his carefully controlled performance falter for just a fraction of a second. The sound of rubber peeling against skin. The child was removing her gloves. Edwin's mind raced. Why would she remove her gloves? To better grasp the money? To avoid leaving fingerprints, though that level of criminal sophistication seemed absurd for a 7-year-old. He strained his other senses, trying to understand what was happening, but the child remained quiet. He heard the soft thump of the yellow gloves being placed on the floor. Then more silence. The room was cold. Edwin kept it that way intentionally. He had always believed that a cold room kept people alert, kept them from getting too comfortable. The thermostat was set to 63 degrees, and even now, in his expensive wool suit, he could feel the chill in the air. His hands, resting on the armrests of his leather chair, were exposed. The skin there was thin, almost translucent, marked with age spots and prominent veins. And in the coldness of the room, his hands had begun to tremble. It was barely noticeable, just the slightest tremor in his fingers, an involuntary response to temperature and age. Edwin had stopped being embarrassed by such things years ago. Growing old meant losing control of your body in small, humiliating increments. The trembling hands, the stiff knees, the way his voice sometimes wavered when he spoke. These were indignities he had accepted. But now, with the child standing beside him, those trembling hands became the center of attention. Edwin heard Lila take a small step closer. Not toward the money, toward him. His confusion deepened. This was wrong. Everything about this moment was deviating from the pattern he had observed dozens of times. The child should be focused on the envelope, on the obvious prize. Instead, she seemed focused on something else entirely. Then he felt it. The lightest touch on his left hand. Edwin's entire body wanted to react, to open his eyes, to pull his hand away, but he forced himself to remain still. Every instinct screamed that something was happening outside the boundaries of his experiment, something he had not anticipated or planned for. But he had to maintain the illusion. He had to see where this led. The touch was gentle, tentative. Small fingers, warm despite the cold room, were making contact with the back of his trembling hand. Not grabbing, not taking, just touching, resting there. Edwin's heart, which had been beating slowly and steadily as part of his performance, suddenly kicked harder in his chest. This was not theft. This was something else. Something he did not have a category for. Through his closed eyelids, he could sense the child leaning closer. He could hear her breathing, soft and measured. There was no excitement in it, no guilty acceleration. She was calm, completely calm, as though what she was doing was the most natural thing in the world. Then he felt her other hand. She was holding both of his hands now, her small, warm palms covering the backs of his cold, trembling fingers. The trembling didn't stop, but her hands remained there, steady and patient. She wasn't trying to still his hands. She was simply sharing her warmth. Edwin's mind struggled to process what was happening. In all his years of testing, of observing, of proving his theories about human nature, no one had ever done this. No one had ever ignored the money and focused on him. Not him as a wealthy target, not him as an employer or a useful connection, but him as a person, as someone who was cold, as someone whose hand shook. The cold room suddenly felt different, not uncomfortable, but somehow exposed. Edwin had designed every aspect of this environment to test others, but now he felt as though he were the one being examined. The child's hands remained on his, offering nothing but warmth, expecting nothing in return. This was not supposed to happen. Edwin felt something crack inside his chest, some carefully constructed wall that he had built brick by brick over decades. It was not a large crack, not yet, but it was there, a fissure in his certainty. The test was collapsing, not because the subject had failed or passed, but because the test itself had become irrelevant. The child had rewritten the rules without saying a word. She had looked at a room full of wealth, and seen only a cold old man with trembling hands. And that, Edwin realized with growing alarm, changed everything. For several seconds, Lila simply held Edwin's hands in her own, her small palms pressed against the backs of his trembling fingers. The warmth of her skin seeped slowly into his cold flesh, and Edwin felt something he had not felt in years. The simple, uncomplicated comfort of human touch offered without agenda. Then the child released his hands, and Edwin heard her move. His heart hammered against his ribs as he struggled to maintain his facade of sleep. What was she doing? His entire body was tense now, though he fought to keep it from showing. Every sound she made felt magnified in the quiet room. He heard the soft rustle of fabric, the faint whisper of movement against carpet, and then he felt something being placed over his hands. The yellow gloves. Lila had picked up the oversized cleaning glove she had been wearing and was now carefully, gently, draping them over Edwin's trembling hands. They were still warm from her body heat and absurdly large against his thin fingers, but she arranged them with the focused care of a child who had been taught to be helpful. She pulled one glove slightly higher on his left hand, adjusting it so it covered more of his exposed wrist. Then she did the same with the right, her movements slow and deliberate, as though she were tucking in a blanket. Edwin's mind reeled. The gloves were ridiculous, inappropriate, completely inadequate for the purpose she intended. And yet, the gesture itself was so purely kind, so utterly without calculation, that it shattered something fundamental in Edwin's understanding of the moment. "There," Lila whispered, so softly that Edwin barely heard it. Her voice was like a breath, carried on the cold air of the room. "That's better." She was talking to herself, or perhaps to him, though she clearly believed he was asleep. There was satisfaction in her whisper, the quiet pride of a child who had solved a problem, who had helped someone. Edwin felt the weight of those rubber gloves on his hands, still warm, and something lodged itself in his throat. The child moved again, and this time Edwin tracked her by sound as she stepped away from his chair. He heard her pause, heard the slight change in her breathing that meant she had noticed something. The envelope. She had finally seen the money. Here it comes, Edwin thought, though the certainty he usually felt was now clouded with something else. Confusion. Hope. Fear. He didn't know anymore. His experiment had already gone so far off course that he couldn't predict what would happen next. Perhaps the gloves had been a preliminary kindness, a way to distract him or win his favor before the theft. Perhaps children were simply more sophisticated in their manipulations than he had given them credit for. But what Lila did next drove another crack through Edwin's carefully constructed worldview. She didn't touch the money. She didn't reach for the envelope or try to peek inside. Instead, Edwin heard a soft intake of breath, the kind of sound someone makes when they notice something alarming. Then came the whisper of movement, quick but controlled, and he felt her presence beside the side table. "Oh no," Lila breathed, her voice so quiet it was almost inaudible. "It's going to fall." The envelope. In Edwin's careful staging, he had positioned it at an angle, half open and tilted, to make the money visible and tempting. But that same positioning meant it was precarious, leaning against the edge of the table in a way that suggested it might slide off at any moment. Lila had not seen $5,000 of opportunity. She had seen something valuable that was about to be lost. Edwin heard the faint scrape of paper against wood as the child carefully, slowly, pushed the envelope back from the edge of the table. She was so gentle, so cautious, that it took her several seconds to complete the task. She was treating the envelope the way someone might handle a sleeping bird, afraid that any sudden movement would cause damage. "There," she whispered again, once the envelope was secure in the center of the table. "Safe now." Then she did something that made Edwin's chest tighten so painfully he thought he might actually be having a heart attack. The child positioned herself beside the side table, standing between Edwin's chair and the envelope like a small sentinel. She folded her hands in front of her red dress, the dress that was too small for her, and she stood perfectly still, watching, guarding. She was protecting the money, not from others who might steal it, but from accidents that might befall it. A strong breeze from the heating vent. A careless elbow if someone walked too close. She had appointed herself its guardian, taking responsibility for something that belonged to someone else, something she believed was important simply because it was clearly valuable. Edwin sat frozen in his chair, the yellow gloves ridiculous and warm on his hands, and felt the full weight of what was happening. This child, who had every reason to take the money, who wore too small clothes and scuffed shoes, whose mother cleaned houses because they had nothing, who probably didn't know what her next good meal would be. This child had looked at $5,000 and seen only something that needed protecting. She had never known she was being tested. That was the revelation that hit Edwin like a physical blow. Every other person he had tested had sensed, on some level, that they were being observed or evaluated. They had looked around for cameras. They had checked to see if anyone was watching. They had been conscious of the moral dimension of their choice. But Lila had no idea. She thought Edwin was asleep. She thought no one was watching. She had been given perfect opportunity, complete privacy, and absolute need. And still, her first instinct had not been to take. It had been to give, to warm cold hands, to protect what might be lost. Edwin's theory, his carefully constructed understanding of human nature, was not just challenged. It was demolished. Because if this child could be kind when no one was watching, when there was no reward and no witness, when her own desperate circumstances screamed at her to do otherwise, then Edwin had been wrong. Not about some people. About everything. The world he thought he understood had just revealed itself to be far more complex, far more mysterious, and far more terrifying than he had ever imagined. Because if he was wrong about this, what else had he been wrong about for the last 40 years? Lila stood guard beside the table, silent and dutiful, while Edwin sat perfectly still in his chair, yellow gloves covering his trembling hands, and felt his certainty crumble into dust. Ruth Carter returned to Edwin's side of the room, carrying a can of furniture polish and a fresh cloth, her movements mechanical and exhausted. She had been working quickly, desperate to finish and leave before anything could go wrong. Her entire body ached with tension, and her mind had been running through worst-case scenarios for the past 20 minutes. What if Lila had moved? What if she had knocked something over? What if Mr. Hawthorne had woken up and seen her? But when Ruth looked toward the corner where she had left her daughter, her heart stopped. The corner was empty. Lila was gone. Ruth's eyes darted frantically around the room, her breath catching in her throat. Then she saw her. Lila was standing beside Edwin Hawthorne's chair, right next to the side table, her small frame positioned like a statue. And on Mr. Hawthorne's hands were Lila's yellow gloves. The world tilted. Ruth's vision blurred at the edges. No. This couldn't be happening. Her daughter had moved, had touched things, had touched him. The old man was going to wake up, was probably already awake, and Ruth's life was about to end. The can of furniture polish slipped from Ruth's fingers and hit the carpet with a dull thump. She rushed forward, her feet moving before her mind could catch up, and grabbed Lila by the shoulders, pulling her back from the chair. "What did you do?" Ruth hissed, her voice breaking. "What did you do?" That was when Edwin opened his eyes. Ruth felt the blood drain from her face. Edwin Hawthorne sat up slowly in his leather chair, the yellow rubber gloves sliding off his hands and falling into his lap. His pale blue eyes, sharp and alert, fixed on Ruth with an expression she couldn't read. He had been awake. He had been watching. Oh God, he had been watching the entire time. "Mr. Hawthorne, Ruth's voice cracked. She pulled Lila behind her, shielding her daughter with her body. "I'm so sorry. I know I shouldn't have brought her. I know she shouldn't have touched anything. Please, The words tumbled out in a desperate torrent. Ruth sank to her knees on the expensive Persian carpet, still gripping Lila's arm, keeping her daughter behind her. Tears burned in her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. She couldn't cry. Crying would make it worse. She had to fix this. She had to make him understand. "It's my fault," Ruth continued, her voice shaking. "She's 7. She doesn't understand. I told her to stay in the corner. I told her not to move, but she's just a child. Please don't." Ruth's throat closed around the words. "Please don't fire me. I'll work extra hours. I'll clean for free. I'll do anything. Just please, we need this job. We don't have anywhere else to go." Edwin remained motionless in his chair, his expression unreadable. The yellow gloves lay absurd and crumpled in his lap. He said nothing, and his silence was more terrifying than any words could have been. Ruth was openly begging now. Her pride dissolved completely in the face of desperation. "I know I broke the rules. I know I shouldn't have brought her here. But the school closed, and I had no one to watch her, and I couldn't miss work, because we can't afford." Her voice broke entirely. "Please." She didn't mean any harm. She was just trying to help. She didn't understand. Behind Ruth, Lila had been silent, watching with wide eyes as her mother collapsed in a panic. But now the little girl stepped forward, gently pulling free from Ruth's grip. "Mama, don't cry," she said softly. "Lila, stay back." Ruth reached for her, but Lila had already moved past her, approaching Edwin's chair with that same calm deliberateness she had shown before. Edwin watched as the child came closer. She stopped about 2 feet from his chair and looked up at him with those clear brown eyes. Then, slowly, she reached down to her wrist and began working at something with her small fingers. It was a bracelet, plastic, bright pink, the kind that came in cheap party favor bags or from quarter machines outside grocery stores. It had a small charm dangling from it, a star, though one of the points had broken off. The elastic was stretched and fraying. The whole thing probably cost less than $1 new, and it was clearly well worn, perhaps the only piece of jewelry this child owned. Lila struggled with the clasp for a moment, her fingers clumsy with nervousness, but finally managed to remove it from her wrist. She held it out to Edwin in both hands, like an offering. "I'm sorry if I broke something," Lila said quietly. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly. "You can have this. It's mine. It's all I have, but you can keep it, to pay for anything that got broken or messed up." Ruth made a choked sound behind her. "Lila, no." But Lila didn't lower her hands. She stood there, a 7-year-old child in a too small red dress and scuffed shoes, offering her only possession to a billionaire because she thought she owed him something, because she thought it was the right thing to do. Edwin stared at the cracked plastic bracelet held out in those small brown hands. The star charm with its broken point caught the light from the table lamp. The frayed elastic dangled loose. The whole thing was worthless. Less than worthless. It was garbage that should have been thrown away months ago. And it was the most valuable thing anyone had ever offered him. Something broke inside Edwin Hawthorne. Not cracked this time. Broke. Shattered completely. 40 years of cynicism, of testing, of proving that people were fundamentally selfish, collapsed in an instant. Because this child understood something Edwin had forgotten, or perhaps had never known at all. Sacrifice wasn't about the monetary value of what you gave up. It was about the proportion of what it cost you. Edwin had given millions to charity, had written checks that made headlines, had buildings named after him. But those millions were nothing to him. Pocket change. Tax write-offs. He had never given anything that hurt to lose. This child was offering him everything she had. The only pretty thing she owned in a life that clearly contained very little that was pretty. She was offering it because she thought she had caused harm, because she wanted to make things right, because somewhere in her short, difficult life, someone had taught her that you take responsibility for your actions, even when it costs you dearly. Edwin's hands shook, and this time it had nothing to do with the cold. His vision blurred. His throat worked, but no sound came out. He stared at that worthless, priceless bracelet and understood, finally, what he had been testing for all these years. He had been testing for the absence of theft, but he had never tested for the presence of goodness. He had looked for people who wouldn't take what wasn't theirs, but he had never looked for people who would give what was. "Keep it," Edwin finally managed to say, his voice hoarse and breaking. "Keep your bracelet, child. You haven't broken anything." But that was a lie. She had broken everything. And Edwin Hawthorne, sitting in his leather chair in his cold study, surrounded by his framed money and his expensive possessions, began to cry. Edwin wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so human and unguarded that it seemed to belong to someone else entirely. He reached down and picked up the yellow gloves from his lap, holding them for a moment as though they were made of something far more precious than rubber. Then he set them carefully on the side table, next to the envelope of money that had started all of this. "I need to tell you something," Edwin said, his voice still rough with emotion. He looked at Ruth, who remained on her knees, frozen in confusion and fear. Then he looked at Lila, who still held out her broken bracelet with steady hands. "I wasn't asleep. I was never asleep." Ruth's face went pale. "Sir, I don't. I was testing you." The words came out flat, bitter in Edwin's mouth. "Both of you. I do this. I pretend to sleep, and I leave money where people can see it, and I wait to see if they'll steal it. I've done it 43 times before today." He gestured weakly toward the envelope. That was the bait. $5,000, deliberately visible, deliberately tempting. "And I was waiting for one of you to take it." Ruth's hands flew to her mouth. Lila lowered her bracelet slowly, her young face processing this information with a seriousness that no 7-year-old should have to possess. "I'm an old fool," Edwin continued, and now his voice cracked again. "I spent 40 years believing that everyone was a thief, that given the chance and the privacy, every human being would take what wasn't theirs. I tested employees, business partners, family members, and most of them failed. Most of them took the money." He looked directly at Lila. "But you didn't even see it, did you? You saw an old man with cold hands." Lila nodded slowly. "You were shaking," she said quietly. "I thought you were cold." "I was cold," Edwin said. "I've been cold for a very long time. Cold in ways that have nothing to do with temperature." He leaned forward in his chair, his elbows on his knees, and for the first time in decades, Edwin Hawthorne looked at another human being without suspicion or calculation. "Ruth, please stand up. You don't need to kneel. You've done nothing wrong." Ruth rose shakily to her feet, pulling Lila close against her side. "Mr. Hawthorne, I don't understand. Are we fired?" "Fired?" Edwin let out a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "No. God, no. You're not fired. He paused, searching for words adequate to what he was feeling. "Ruth, I want to apologize to you. Not as your employer. As one human being to another. I put you in an impossible situation. I tested you as though you were a subject in an experiment rather than a person. And your daughter taught me something I should have learned 60 years ago." He stood up from his chair, his movements slow and stiff. He walked to his desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a leather-bound checkbook. Ruth watched with wide, uncertain eyes as he uncapped a pen and began to write. "I'm giving you a raise," Edwin said as he wrote. "Effective immediately, your salary is tripled. And I'm establishing a household account in your name. $50,000, replenished quarterly, for any expenses related to your work or your daughter's needs." He tore out the check and held it out to Ruth. Ruth didn't move. She stared at the check as though it might bite her. "Sir, I can't. That's too much. I just clean. You raised a child who sees people instead of things," Edwin interrupted. "That's worth more than any amount I could write on this paper. Please, take it. And there's more." He set the check on the desk and returned to his chair, suddenly exhausted. "I want to establish an education fund for Lila. Full tuition, books, supplies, everything from elementary school through university. Whatever she wants to study, wherever she wants to go." "What?" Ruth whispered. Tears were streaming down her face now. "Why would you do this?" "Because I've spent 40 years investing in the wrong things," Edwin said simply. "I've accumulated buildings and businesses and bank accounts, and all of it has made me exactly nothing. But your daughter, in 5 minutes, show me what wealth actually looks like." He looked at Lila. "It looks like kindness when no one is watching. It looks like giving when you have nothing to give. That's the inheritance that matters, not money. Character." Over the following months, Edwin kept his promises. Ruth moved out of her cramped apartment into a small house that Edwin purchased outright and put in her name. She continued to work, but with dignity and security she had never known. Lila started at a new school, one with music programs and art classes and teachers who had time to nurture rather than simply manage. And Edwin changed. He stopped testing people. He dismantled his elaborate traps. The framed money came down from his study walls. Instead, he began investing in people, scholarships, small business loans, housing assistance. Not as tax write-offs or publicity stunts, but as genuine attempts to provide others with the opportunities for dignity that he had so nearly destroyed in Ruth and Lila. 15 years later, Edwin Hawthorne died peacefully in his sleep. The real kind this time, not the pretend version. He was 97 years old. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had changed in those final years. Students he had educated, families he had housed, businesses he had helped launch. Ruth and Lila were there, of course. Lila was 22 now, finishing medical school on a full scholarship from the Hawthorne Foundation. She wore a simple black dress and, on her wrist, a pink plastic bracelet with a broken star charm that she had never offered to anyone again. When the will was read, there were many beneficiaries. Edwin had distributed his wealth carefully, thoughtfully, to hundreds of causes and individuals. But the majority of his estate, his companies, his properties, his personal fortune, went to Lila Carter. Not because she had asked for it, not because she had manipulated or schemed or positioned herself, but because Edwin had spent his final years watching her grow into exactly the kind of person he had once believed didn't exist. Someone who saw wealth as responsibility rather than privilege. Someone who remembered what it felt like to have nothing, and who would use everything to help others. The letter Edwin left for her was brief. Lila, you gave me warm hands when mine were cold. You protected what wasn't yours. You offered all you had to make things right. This is not payment for those actions. Kindness cannot be purchased. This is simply my hope that you will continue to be exactly who you already are, and that you will have the resources to spread that warmth to others who are cold. You are my true heir because you understand that the greatest inheritance we can leave is not money, but the example of how to be human. Thank you for teaching an old fool what he should have known all along. Lila read the letter 3 times, standing in the lawyer's office where her entire life had just changed. Then she folded it carefully, placed it in her pocket next to her heart, and went home to tell her mother. She had work to do, people to help, warmth to share, and somewhere, perhaps, an old man was finally resting in peace, knowing that his fortune would be carried forward by hands that had once been covered in yellow rubber gloves, reaching out not to take, but to give. If this story touched your heart, please share it. In a world that often teaches us to be suspicious, to protect what's ours, to test others before we trust them, we need reminders that kindness still exists. That goodness is real. That a child's instinct to warm cold hands can change everything. Let this story be a reminder. The greatest wealth we possess isn't measured in bank accounts, but in our capacity to see each other's humanity and respond with compassion. Share this message. Be the warmth someone needs today.